Okay, you should be able to see some slides here. So I know that we are all spread out across various parts of the country and potentially even outside of the US as well. But even with that distance, I do want to start today by acknowledging and honoring the indigenous communities native to the region where I am here in Indiana, recognizing that my university, Indiana University Bloomington, was built on indigenous homelands and resources, and recognizing the Miami, the Delaware, the Potawatomi, and Shawnee people as past, present, and future caretakers of this land. And beyond that, I also want to acknowledge that we are in a moment of reckoning with systemic racism and other systemic inequities in our society. We can see evidence of those inequities in the fact that Black, Indigenous, and Latinx communities have been hit hardest by the COVID-19 pandemic. And we can see evidence of those inequities in the violence that police officers and private citizens continue to perpetuate against Black people in the US, even in the midst of a pandemic. So I also want to start by leaving a moment of silence for the lives that have been taken and for the pain and the loss that so many people, including our colleagues, our students, staff members, and friends, are experiencing right now in the wake of this pandemic and social disruptions. So I'll leave a moment of silence here. Thank you all for taking that moment, and thank you for being part of this conversation today and for being willing to think critically about your own pedagogy and about the role that educators can play in systems of oppression. I know that certainly I still have much work to do in my own teaching, and I know that being an anti-racist or anti-sexist or anti-classist educator isn't a title that I can give myself. It's something I have to strive for in the decisions that I make every day. And my hope is that today's conversation will help you reflect on the work that you can do in your own practice as well. And so, along those lines, and as we'll talk about today, the uncertainties around the COVID-19 pandemic are creating tremendous challenges for students and especially students from systematically marginalized groups. As educators, we have a responsibility to support students through those challenges and through the trauma that they're facing right now. Essentially, we have a responsibility to teach for equity and with empathy. And I'll talk in the session today about why many of our traditional teaching practices don't achieve that kind of equity or empathy. And then I'll be giving, as Mary mentioned, a series of lightning talks this afternoon uh, that help to highlight or outline ways that we can adopt a more equitable or more empathetic approach in our own teaching. So, along those lines, and in the wake of the pandemic, it's important to note that college students are facing a great deal of inconsistency and uncertainty in their lives. In terms of inconsistency, for example, some students are juggling a mix of online and in-person classes. That's certainly true at IU where I teach. Meanwhile, even if students are taking all of their classes online, their instructors may be approaching online instruction in very different ways, different modes of teaching, synchronous versus asynchronous, different platforms, Zoom versus Canvas versus Kaltura versus Teams. And then also different policies, different attendance policies, different engagement policies, different amounts of flexibility around things like assignments and exams. And we know that those kinds of inconsistencies can fuel anxiety for students, worrying about getting it right. It's easy for us to focus on why can't you just read the syllabus? But if they're taking 4 or 5 classes and they all have different syllabi, it can be hard for students to keep track of what they're expected to do, especially when so many other things in their lives feel inconsistent or uncertain right now. And to that end, on top of the inconsistency that students are facing, they're also facing considerable uncertainty. What happens, for example, if someone they know gets sick? What happens if one of their instructors or classmates gets sick? What happens if campus has to close if it's currently open? Or what might happen politically or public health wise that could make the current situation better or so much worse? So essentially, while these kinds of inconsistencies and uncertainties are challenging for all students. They're especially harmful for students from systematically marginalized groups. And that's because students from systematically marginalized groups disproportionately face additional challenges that add to the stress and the uncertainties that they face both in normal times and certainly during the pandemic as well. Some of those additional challenges are related to digital inequalities. Some students, for example, lack access to reliable technology for online learning. Here at Indiana University, where I teach, for example, there was a recent survey done of 25,000 undergraduate students, and it found that about 9% of students don't have access to internet at all when they're not on campus. And meanwhile, in research that I conducted pre-pandemic with my colleagues Amy Gonzalez and Teresa Lynch, we found that about 20% of college students don't have access to high quality laptops or tablets that they can rely on when doing their work. They often rely on sort of unreliable devices instead, and that creates all sorts of challenges for them. And that those challenges we find disproportionately impact students from low income families and students of color. And those challenges we find have real consequences for students. In our research and even before the pandemic, my colleagues and I found that students with less reliable access to technology got significantly lower grades in college and experienced significantly higher levels of stress during the semester. And we can imagine that the impact of not having a reliable laptop or reliable access to internet is likely to be even bigger right now with so many courses moving online. Now, on top of those kinds of tech-related inequalities, some students are also struggling to make ends meet financially. Sociologist Sarah Goldrick-Rab, for example, recently surveyed 167,000 college students across the US, and she found that even before the pandemic, 17% of students had been homeless at some point in the past year, and 39% had experienced food insecurity, not being able to get enough food to eat. Now, with the pandemic wreaking havoc on the economy, there are likely to be even more students struggling to make ends meet. And we know that those struggles take a real toll on students. Students dealing with financial insecurity are more likely to, for example, leave college without getting a degree. And even if they do stay enrolled, they're often much more likely to find it difficult to stay focused in class and get their work done as well. So, on top of those kinds of economic challenges, and especially in the wake of the pandemic, many students also have added responsibilities outside of school that make it hard for them in many cases to focus on learning. That includes, for example, students with family obligations and especially student parents. Research shows that about 12% of public four-year college students have children, and those students are disproportionately women of color. While student parents, they do typically get good grades in college, about half at the same time end up leaving college before they get their degree. And that's because student parents face serious hurdles like the high cost of childcare. The average cost of center-based childcare in the US, my undergraduates are always astounded by this figure, is about $1,000 a month. And for many families, that is a tremendously high cost to bear. And those barriers are likely to be even higher now for student parents and students with care responsibilities now that many K-12 schools are closed and with many childcare facilities closed, and also with extended family members often needing help, elderly family members or sick relatives needing care as well. In addition to student parents, we can also think about students with work obligations who may be facing an especially difficult time right now. Research shows, for example, that about 70% of full-time college students work while they're going to school. And that work is particularly burdensome for students from low-income families. Those students typically work more hours than students from higher income families. And the money that they earn from their jobs during college, it's not just going for extras to pay for a night out. Instead, they're using that money to support their own basic needs and often sending money back to their families to help support their families as well. And that added pressure can make it difficult for students from low income families to stay on track grade wise and to finish their degrees. And at the same time, because of the pandemic, some students may have lost their jobs that they depend on for financial support. And some may also now have jobs where they have to interact with people face to face, working in retail or food service, effectively putting their own health at risk just to be able to make ends meet or pay their tuition to even stay in school. And along those lines, we have to consider the fact that some students have more reason than others to worry about their health and their safety right now. Some students, for example, have serious health conditions that put them at greater risk with respect to COVID-19. Those students, meanwhile, may opt to do something like take all their classes online. But if those students also have limited access to technology, then they may have to make tough decisions about whether to prioritize their health or prioritize their academics. And even if those students do have the technology that they need to participate in online classes, they'll still be especially vulnerable to the feelings of isolation and disconnection from their instructors and their peers that we know are rampant right now among college students. And in terms of health, and even if they don't have specific health conditions, students may also be reluctant to come to campus or find it more difficult to engage if they're members of groups that have been disproportionately affected by COVID-19. We know, for example, that African Americans make up only 13% of the US population, but they account for 20% of COVID cases and more than 20% of COVID related deaths. Similarly, people who identify as Hispanic or Latinx make up about 18% of the US population, but they account for more than 30% of COVID cases. And what that means then is that the students in racial and ethnic groups hit hardest by the virus are more likely to have friends and family members who have gotten seriously ill or even died during the pandemic. And that trauma is likely to impact their ability to focus this year in their classes. These students may also be justifiably more worried about getting sick themselves, especially if they risk giving it to their parents or their grandparents or to other people in their lives. Now, unfortunately, the risk of getting COVID-19 isn't the only thing that Black students and other students of color have to worry about when they come to campus this year or really any year. Recent Black Lives Matter demonstrations, for example, have raised awareness of police violence against Black people and honored the lives of those killed by police. It's important to remember, though, that this violence isn't new, and it often has been sanctioned by the state, beginning with slavery, continuing with the Black codes and Jim Crow laws, through mass incarceration and the war on drugs. And it's also important to remember that the pandemic hasn't stopped the racist violence or harassment that Black people face, even in college towns. And faced with that kind of systemic racism, Black students and other students of color often find it difficult to feel like they belong on campus. And now, especially with all of us being so disconnected, that limited sense of belonging that some students, and especially students of color, experience on college campuses may make it even harder for those students to get the support that they need to be successful this year and in the future. Along those lines, recent research has shown that in the wake of the pandemic, many college students are struggling with mental health. There was a survey done that showed that more than 25% of young people ages 18 to 24 had considered suicide at some point in the past 4 weeks. This was about a month and a half ago. Also, more than 25% of students reported young people ages 18 to 24 reported an increase in substance use as a way to cope with the added stress that they're experiencing during the pandemic. And we also know that those numbers are substantially higher among Black and Hispanic people than they are among white, non Hispanic people in terms of their mental health right now in the wake of the pandemic. And these numbers should make it painfully clear the trauma that students are facing in the wake of this pandemic. And they should also make clear the need to avoid inflicting further harm on students through the decisions that we make in our courses and in our interactions with students this year as well. Essentially, if we as educators fail to support our students through the challenges that we're facing, we run the risk of making the situation worse, exacerbating inequities in students' academic outcomes and in students' physical and mental health as well. At the same time, though, we can't just wait for students to tell us that they need help. In some of my other research focused on students and help seeking, I find that the students who need the most support are often the ones who are most reluctant to ask. That includes students from lower income families, first generation college students, students of color. Those students often worry, often justifiably, about how they'll be judged for needing help. They worry of burdening others with requests. They don't feel entitled to make demands on educators or other professionals the way that many of privileged peers take for granted. As educators, then, it's our responsibility to ensure that our students get the support that they need to learn and succeed, even without having to explicitly ask for that kind of support. And as I'll talk about, one of the best ways to do that is to try to teach explicitly with empathy and for equity. So what does that mean? What would it mean to teach for equity? Broadly speaking, what I'm talking about here is the idea of ensuring that all students have access to the support that they need to learn, and to be successful in class. And certainly, this concept of equity is different from the concept of equality of opportunity in that it recognizes that some students will need more help than others to reach the same goal. That's essentially the idea that this cartoon is trying to illustrate here, that the difference between equality, where everyone gets the same thing, and equity, which instead is about making sure that everyone has the same opportunity to get to an outcome, and that requires different resources for different people, depending on their starting point. So essentially, then, to ensure that all students can access the kind of support that they need, it's helpful. One place to start with that is to develop courses on principles of universal design. And universal design is the idea that experiences should be made as fully accessible to as many people as possible without the need for individual accommodations. At a very basic level, universal design involves things like letting students know upfront what will be expected of them. What tools will they need in this class? What tech tools? What knowledge do they need coming in? What physical resources do they need to have? What will they be expected to do? What will they be expected to produce? And then how will they be evaluated? The more that students can know that upfront, the easier it is for them to navigate the course and get the help that they need. Another key step in universal design is presenting information in multiple ways. For example, if you are teaching a synchronous class, making sure that students who get sick during the semester or who are not able to make it to class because of childcare responsibilities or work responsibilities are able to get that same information asynchronously as well. And then also making essential information, I mean, this is kind of basic nuts and bolts here, but as audible and legible as possible, and giving students time to process that information. Taking those kinds of steps is kind of like putting a window into that wall that we saw on the previous slide. Going a step further, though, we might even think about taking down that wall entirely, essentially removing barriers to individual learning and achievement. That wall, I would argue, that we saw in the cartoon is a good metaphor for so many of the status quo teaching practices and policies that we take for granted in higher ed. We like to think of those policies and procedures as meritocratic. The inequalities they create are often seen as justified rather than problematic or harmful instead. Let's take, for example, attendance policies. When students don't show up for our classes, it's easy to think that they just don't care. But if we make that assumption, then it makes it easy to use graded attendance to reward those students who do show up and to try to incentivize those who don't. In reality, though, and especially if we're talking about students from systematically marginalized groups, then it's much more likely that if they're not showing up or engaging, there's something going on in their lives that's preventing them from being there and doing the work. And if we make that assumption instead, if we start from a place of what might be happening in their lives that's preventing them from showing up, then grading attendance or engagement really makes no sense at all. And so, if we want to adopt a more inclusive approach to pedagogy, we have to treat a lack of engagement or attendance as a sign that students might need more help than what they're currently getting. And so, I'd say it's okay to take attendance and track engagement, but use it as an opportunity to reach out and check in with students who are having trouble staying engaged and offer them extra support or help them connect with resources on campus instead. Or to give another example, let's think about proctored online exams. If students are taking proctored exams, that might mean that someone is physically watching them through their webcam, that's sort of live proctoring, or a machine is scanning their face and watching their movements and their eyes, automated proctoring instead. Now we can think about why that might be problematic from an equity perspective. In terms of live proctoring, we know that students have very different home environments. Students with limited resources, lots of roommates, or other types of challenging situations may feel especially uncomfortable if someone is watching them in their home, especially while they're taking an exam. And that discomfort might make it more difficult for them to do well on those kinds of exams. And meanwhile, even with things like automated proctoring, there's evidence that facial recognition software has problems reading darker skinned faces and very light skinned faces, which can lead to more error messages and false flags, especially for students of color. And students may also be falsely flagged as cheating if they have children or roommates who come in and out of the screen behind them, or if they have to glance away repeatedly for some reason. And so essentially what that means then is that these systems, while they may seem meritocratic, have the potential to do substantial harm to students when they're implemented in classes. And even without proctoring, timed online exams are problematic from an equity perspective. Essentially, we know that timed exams don't work well for students with learning disabilities. That's why extended time is legally required for many of our students. But timed exams, especially timed online exams, also create barriers for other students as well. We can imagine, for example, let's imagine that the only device that a student has to use to access the internet is their cell phone. And I found in my research with my colleagues that that's the case for many college students, especially students from low-income families. So do we think it's fair to give that student who has to use their cell phone to take an exam the same amount of time to complete that exam as a student who can use a laptop or a computer with a full keyboard and a nice big wide screen? I'd argue that's not fair. Or imagine that a student is, say, a single mom with young kids at home and her kids' daycare is closed. And imagine that she lives in an apartment with Wi-Fi that constantly cuts in and out, forcing her to take her kids with her and sit in the car in a McDonald's parking lot while she takes her exam. Do we think it's fair to give that student the same amount of time for her exam as a student who has access to reliable high-speed internet and her own apartment where she can sit quietly by herself and take the exam at home? Again, I would argue that's not fair. And so if we want our courses to be inclusive, we have to look for alternatives. We have to look for alternatives to things like timed online exams and maybe alternatives to exams more generally. And we should either give those exams to everyone or those alternatives to everyone, or at the very least, make the alternatives available to any student who needs them without forcing those students to prove that they deserve a more flexible approach. So along those lines, teaching for equity and with empathy means avoiding the kinds of rigid procedures and policies and assignments and deadlines, and instead looking for ways to build in flexibility for students without having to put them in a position where they have to ask for it or prove that they deserve it instead. Because we know that that sort of proving process advantages students from much more privileged backgrounds instead. So we can also think about how this plays with things like assignments. Tech-heavy assignments, for example, might be difficult for students who would usually rely on campus computers and who might not be able to do those assignments from home, especially if campuses are closed right now. So you might consider extending deadlines on those assignments or offering lower tech alternatives for those kinds of assignments that students can complete instead. We could also think about group project assignments. Certainly, group project assignments can be great for both students and faculty, but they can also be especially difficult for students right now, especially for students with limited tech resources or with limited time to be able to coordinate with their peers outside of class. And then another practice that I want to briefly touch on in terms of why it might be problematic right now is the way that we grade students. This the way that we assign grades to students, it kind of seems meritocratic, but arguably, especially if students are, say, graded on a curve, the students who get the most answers right on a test or assignment get the highest grades, and then grades go down from there. That's, that's kind of standard practice here. But even if they're not graded on a curve, many instructors use a sort of one chance approach to grading where students don't have the opportunity to learn from their mistakes or to do better a second or third time. And we can think about why that might be problematic from an equity perspective. Imagine, for example, that the class is an introductory engineering class. Some of the students in that class probably took AP Physics and AP Calc in high school. Some might have been on the robotics team or gone to coding camp in the summers when they were kids. And those students are probably much more likely to come from more privileged backgrounds. Meanwhile, other students in that class probably went to high schools that didn't even offer AP classes or extracurricular activities. And those students' families probably didn't have the money for extra classes or extra tutors or special camps. So which of those two groups of students do we think will feel more confident about learning in their introduction to engineering class? And which do we think will consistently do better on quizzes and tests? So essentially, then we have to think about if we grade students on a curve, or if we only give students one chance to earn a particular grade, we're almost automatically going to be grading students on their privilege and punishing students for facing challenges that were far outside of their own control. So I'll kind of move toward wrapping things up here with the 2 minutes that we have left. My hope is that our conversation today has helped you think about how the kinds of taken for granted teaching practices that we often implement in our classes have the potential to be harmful for students and how those practices may be especially harmful for students right now. I also hope that our discussion today will inspire you to think critically about your own teaching and maybe even take down some of the barriers to equity that exist in your own classroom practice. Of course, then at the same time, I understand that the changing our status quo teaching practices involves a tremendous amount of work, both mentally and logistically. And so I don't think it's reasonable to expect every instructor to redesign every single one of their courses for this semester or for next semester or potentially even for next fall. Instead, I think it's okay to start small, to think about sort of one or two or three practices or policies that you might change in the short term and then go from there. And certainly then I hope that you'll join me for this afternoon's lightning talk where I'll be offering some recommendations for some specific strategies to use in teaching for equity and with empathy, including building trusting relationships with students, especially when courses are online. Also for implementing some alternatives to some of these punitive policies that we talked about today. And then also potentially things like using ungrading or other types of grading alternatives as a potentially more equitable solution to evaluating students' work. So thank you so much for joining me today. And I will hopefully see you all later this afternoon as well.